So, hello and welcome back yet again to Mr. Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, where it seems like our intrepid crew has had a bit of a setback. It seems like, at least according to Axel, they've ended up right back on the shore that they left after uh, I would call it a harrowing journey. I mean, they got to watch prehistoric beasties fighting each other, and then they sailed right into that storm that I was worried about. So, doesn't seem like they're having the best time of all, especially the poor professor, who I don't think he's going to take this well. I mean, I could be wrong, but based on evidence so far, I don't think the professor is going to actually take this little setback sitting down. But I guess we'll have to wait and see as we jump back into Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, beginning with chapter 37. It is impossible to describe the succession of emotions that shook Professor Lindenbrock. Amazement, incredulity, and finally, rage. Never had I seen a man so disoriented at first and then so furious. The exhaustion of our journey across the ocean, the dangers we had incurred, all that had to be started over again. We had gone backwards instead of forwards, but my uncle quickly regained control of himself. Ah, fate plays tricks on me, he said. The elements conspire against me. Air, fire, and water join their efforts to oppose my journey. Well then, they'll find out what my willpower is made of. I will not yield. I will not take a single step backwards, and we'll see whether man or nature wins. Standing on the rock, enraged and threatening, Otto Lindenbrock seemed to challenge the gods like the fierce Ajax. But I thought it was appropriate to intervene and restrain his irrational energy. Listen to me, I said to him in a firm voice. There's a limit to ambition down here. We can't struggle against the impossible. We're ill-equipped for another sea voyage. One can't travel 500 leagues on a paltry assemblage of wood beams with a blanket for a sail, a stick for a mast, and the winds unleashed against us. We can't steer. We're a plaything for storms, and it's madness to attempt this impossible crossing for a second time. I was able to unfold this series of irrefutable reasons for 10 minutes without being interrupted, but only because of the inattention of the professor, who wasn't listening to a word of my arguments. To the raft, he shouted. That was his reply. It was no use begging him or flying into a rage. I was up against a will that was harder than granite. Hans was finishing up the repairs of the raft at that moment. One would have thought that this strange being guessed my uncle's plans. He had reinforced the vessel with a few pieces of Struderbrand. He had already hoisted a sail, in whose folds the wind was already playing. The professor said a few words to our guide, and immediately he put everything on board and arranged everything for our departure. The air was rather clear, and the northwest wind blew steady. What could I do? Stand alone against the two of them? Impossible. If only Hans had taken my side, but no. The Icelander seemed to have given up any will of his own and to have made a vow of self-denial. I could not get anything out of a servant so beholden to his master. I had to go along. I was therefore about to take my usual place on the raft when my uncle stopped me with his hand. "We won't leave until tomorrow," he said. I made the gesture of a man who is resigned to anything. "I must not neglect anything," the professor resumed. "And since fate has driven me to this part of the coast, I won't leave it till I've explored it." To understand this remark, one must know that we had come back to the North Shore, but not the exact point of our first departure. Port Gräuben must have been further to the west. Therefore, nothing was more reasonable than to explore carefully the surroundings of our new landing spot. "Let's go on a discovery," I said. And leaving Hans to his activities, we set off together. The space between the water and the foot of the cliffs was considerable, and it took us half an hour to get to the wall of rock. Our feet crushed innumerable shells of all shapes and sizes, in which the animals of early ages had lived. I also saw enormous turtle shells that were more than 15 feet in diameter. They had belonged to those gigantic glycodonts of the Pliocene period, of which the modern turtle is a small reduction. The ground was, in addition, strewn with a lot of stone fragments, shingles of a sort that had been rounded by the waves and arranged in lines. This led me to the remark that at one time the sea must have covered this ground. On the scattered rocks, now out of their reach, the waves had left manifest trace of their passage. This might, up to a point, explain the existence of this ocean 40 leagues beneath the surface of the globe, but in my opinion, this liquid mass had to be gradually disappearing into the bowels of the earth, and it obviously had its origin in the waters of the ocean overhead, which must have made their way here through some fissure. Yet it had to be conceded that this fissure was now closed up, because this entire cavern, or more truthfully, this immense reservoir, had filled up in a relatively short time and had already partially evaporated. That would explain the clouds suspended over our heads and the discharge of the electricity that gave rise to tempests in the interior of the globe. This theory of the phenomenon we had witnessed seemed satisfactory to me. For however great the wonders of nature may be, they can always be explained by physical causes. We were therefore walking on a kind of sedimentary terrain, deposited by water like all soils of that period, of which there are so many across the globe. The professor examined every fissure in the rock carefully. Whenever an opening showed, it was important for him to probe its depth. We had walked along the shores of the Lindenbrock Sea for a mile when the soil suddenly changed in appearance. It seemed to turn upside down, convulsed by a violent upheaval of the lower strata. In many places, depressions or elevations testified to a powerful displacement of the earth's substance. We were moving with some difficulty across these cracks of granite mixed with flint and quartz and alluvial deposits, when a field, more than a field actually, a plain of bones appeared before our eyes. One would have thought it was an immense graveyard where the generations of 20 centuries mingled their eternal dust. Tall mounds of residue stretched away into the distance. They undulated to the limits of the horizon and vanished into a hazy mist. Here, in perhaps 3 square miles, the complete history of animal life was piled up, a history that has hardly yet been written in the two recent strata of the inhabited world. But impatient curiosity drove us on. With a dry noise, our feet crushed the remains of these prehistoric animals, fossils over whose rare and interesting residues the museums of great cities would fight. 1,000 Cuviers would not have been enough to reconstruct the skeletons of the organic beings lying on this magnificent boneyard. I was stunned. My uncle had lifted his long arms to the massive vault that served us as a sky, his mouth gaping wide, his eyes flashing behind the glass of his spectacles, his head moving up and down, left and right. His entire posture indicated infinite amazement. He stood facing an invaluable collection of Leptotheria, Mercicontheria, Lophodons, Anotheria, Megatheria, Mastodons, Protopiththeria, Pterodactyls, all of the prehistoric monsters piled up for his personal satisfaction. Imagine an enthusiastic bibliophile suddenly transported to a famous library like Alexandria that was burned by Omar and which by a miracle had suddenly been reborn. That was the attitude of my uncle, Professor Lindenbrock. But it was a very different amazement. When running across this organic dust, he seized a bare skull and shouted in a trembling voice, "Axel! Axel, a human head!" "A human head?" I said, no less astonished. "Yes, nephew. Ah, Mr. Milne Edwards, Mr. de Quatrefuges, I wish you were standing here where I, Otto Lindenbrock, am now standing." And that is the end of chapter 37. We do have a picture, though, the complex and complete history of the animal world piled up on this plain that they have discovered. I like how it's I think Triceratops, except that's not a Triceratops because I don't see 3 horns. Well, I guess the nose horn counts. You know, I would have to brush up on my history of dinosaurs to be able to identify very many of them. They've changed a lot because science never sits still, which is a good thing. Speaking of sitting still, you guys sit right here. I'm going to get a drink and we'll be right back. All right, we are back, where, unless he has completely misidentified it, Professor Lindenbrock has just upended all of evolution, but maybe he just found an Australopithecine. I guess we'll have to wait and see. As we jump back into chapter 38 of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Mr. Jules Verne. To understand my uncle's invocation of these illustrious French scholars, one must know that an event of great importance for paleontology had occurred recently before our departure. On March 28, 1863, some excavators working under the direction of Mr. Boucher de Perthes in the stone quarries of Moulin-Quingon near Abbeville, in the department of the Saône in France, had found a human jawbone 14 feet below the surface. It was the first fossil of its kind that had ever been unearthed. Nearby, stone hatchets and flint arrowheads were found, stained and coated with a uniform patina of ages. The repercussions of this discovery were great. not in France alone, but also in England and Germany. Several scholars of the French Institute, among others Messrs. Milne Edwards and de Quatrefages, took the affair very seriously and provided the irrefutable authenticity of the bone in question, and became the most ardent advocates in this trial of the jawbone, as it had been called in English. Geologists of the United Kingdom, who considered the fact as certain, Messrs. Falconer, Busk, Carpenter, and others, were soon joined by scholars from Germany, and among them, in the first rank, the most energetic, the most enthusiastic, was my uncle Lindenbrock. The authenticity of a human fossil from the Quaternary epoch therefore seemed to be irrefutably proven and admitted. This theory, to be sure, encountered a most obstinate opponent in Monsieur Alain de Beaumont. This scholar, a great authority, maintained the soil of the Moulin Quignon did not belong to the diluvium, but to a more recent layer, and agreeing with Cuvier, he refused to admit that the human species had been contemporary with the animals of the Quaternary epoch. My uncle Lindenbrock, in agreement with the great majority of geologists, had stood his ground, disputed and argued until Mr. Alain de Beaumont had remained almost alone on his side of the argument. We knew all the details of this affair, but we were not aware that since our departure the question had made further progress. Other identical jawbones, though they belonged to individuals of various types and different nations, had been found in the loose gray soil of certain caves in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, along with weapons, utensils, tools, bones of children, adolescents, adults, and old people. The existence of Quaternary man was therefore receiving more confirmation each and every day. And that was not all. New remains exhumed from tertiary Paleocene soil had allowed even bolder geologists to attribute an even greater age to the human race. These remains, to be sure, were not human bones, but products of his industry that carried the mark of human work, like the shin and thigh bones of fossil animals with regular groups, almost sculpted. Thus, with one leap, man moved back on the time scale by many, many centuries. He preceded the mastodon. He was a contemporary of Elphamas Merendolius. He lived 100,000 years ago, since that is the date the most famous geologists give for the formation of the Pliocene soil. This, then, was the state of paleontological science, and what we knew of it was enough to explain our attitude towards this boneyard on the Lindenbrock Sea. It is, therefore, easy to understand my uncle's amazement and joy when 20 yards further on he found himself in the presence of, one might say, face to face with a specimen of Quaternary man. It was a perfectly recognizable human body. Had some special kind of soil, like that in the St. Michael Cemetery in Bordeaux, preserved it like this over the centuries? I don't know. But this corpse, with its tight parchment-like skin, its limbs still soft, at least on sight, its intact teeth, abundant hair, frighteningly long finger and toenails, presented itself to our eyes just as it was when it had been alive. I was speechless when faced with this apparition of another age. My uncle, normally a talkative and impetuous speaker, was also silent. We had lifted the body, we had raised it up, it looked at us with its empty eye sockets, we touched its torso. After a few moments of silence, my uncle was overcome and he became Professor Otto Lindenbrock again, who, carried away by his temperament, forgot the circumstances of our journey, the place where we were, the cave that surrounded us. No doubt he thought he was at the Jontime, lecturing to his students, because he assumed a learned voice and began to address an imaginary audience. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have the honor of introducing a man of the Quaternary period to you. Eminent scholars have denied his existence. Others, no less eminent, have affirmed it. The St. Thomases of paleontology, if they were here, would touch him with their fingers and would be forced to acknowledge their errors. I am quite aware that science has to be on its guard with discoveries of this kind. I know how Barnum and other charlatans of his ilk have exploited fossil men. I know the story of the Ajax kneecap, the alleged body of Orchestrius found by the Spartans, and of the 10-cubit tall body of Asterius mentioned by Parnassus. I've read the reports on the skeletons of Tarpani, discovered back in the 14th century, which was at the time identified as that of Polyphemus, and the history of the giant unearthed in the 16th century near Palmero. You know as well as I do, gentlemen, the analysis of large bones carried out at the Lucerne in 1577, which the famous Felix Planter declared to be those of a 19-foot tall giant. I have personally devoured the treatises of Casseron and all of the distributions, pamphlets, speechlets, and rejoinders that were published respecting the skeleton of Chunobas, a king of the Cimbrians and an invader of Gaul, that had been dug out of a sandpit at the Daphne in 1613. In the 18th century, I would have fought with Pierre Campet against the pre-Admites of Senachner. In my hands, I have a text called Gigan. Here, my uncle's natural weakness reemerged, that of being unable to pronounce difficult words in public. Side note, I probably mangled every one of those words. The text called Gigan. He could go no further. Gigantio? Impossible. The unfortunate word just would not come out. They would have laughed at him in the Jotunheim. Gigantosology, the professor finally managed to say, in between two curse words. Then he continued his imaginary speech with renewed energy and spirit. Yes, gentlemen, I know all these things. I also know that Cuvier and Blombach have identified these bones as simple bones of mammoths and other animals of the Quaternary period. But in this case, doubt would be an insult to science. The corpse is here. You can see it. You can touch it. It is not a skeleton. It's an intact body preserved for purely anthropological purposes. I was taking great care not to contradict his assertion. If I could wash it in a solution of sulfuric acid, said my uncle, I would be able to remove all the bits of soil and the splendid shells embedded in it. but I do not have this precious solvent at hand. Yet, such as it is, the body will tell its own story. And here the professor took the fossil corpse and handled it with the skill of a showman. You see, he said, it is not even 6 feet tall, and we are very far removed from those alleged giants. As for the race to which it belongs, obviously it's a Caucasian. It's our own race. The skull of this fossil is a regular oval with no prominent cheekbones, no projecting jaw. It shows no sign of the prognathism that diminishes the facial angle. Measure that angle, it's almost 90 degrees. But I'll go even further in my deductions, and I dare say this human specimen belongs to the Japthetic family, which extends from India to the boundaries of Western Europe. Don't you laugh at me, gentlemen. No one was there, so no one was smiling, but the professor was used to seeing faces spread out in smiles during his lectures. Yes, he said with a new energy. This is a fossil man, a contemporary of the mastodons whose bones fill this amphitheater. But if you ask me how he came here, how the layers in which he was buried slid into this cavern in the earth, I will not allow myself to answer. No doubt, in the Quaternary period, considerable upheavals still took place in the earth's crust. The gradual cooling of the globe created cracks, fissures, and faults into which some of the upper soil most likely fell. I want to make no assertions, but, after all, the man is here, surrounded by the work of his hands, by the hatchets and the flint arrowheads that made the Stone Age possible, and unless he came here as a tourist and a pioneer of science like I did, I cannot doubt the authenticity of his ancient origin. Here the professor fell silent, so I broke into unanimous applause. In any case, my uncle was right, and more learned men than his nephew would have a lot of trouble arguing with him. Another clue. This fossilized body was not the only one in the cement boneyard. We found other corpses at every step we took in this dust, and my uncle could choose the most wonderful of these specimens to take home and convince the skeptics. Indeed, it was an amazing spectacle. These generations of men and animals commingled in this cemetery. But one serious question did arise that we dared not answer. Had these beings slid down to the shore of the Lindenbrock Sea through an upheaval in the ground when they were already fossilized? Or did they rather dwell in this underground world, under this artificial sky, living and dying like the inhabitants of the earth? Until now, only sea monsters and fishes had appeared to us alive. Did some man of the abyss still wander on this deserted strand? And that is where the chapter ends. That's a very good question. Are there some non-fossilized men? Also, I know that I butchered like 80% of those words, and I do apologize for that. It's, at this point, my identifying characteristic, I think. Also, those words are hard. I can practice them all I want, but the minute the camera comes on and I'm actually reading them, I forget what I looked up as far as pronunciation. But it did make for an interesting little story. I like the professor just going into suddenly, I'm a lecturer and I'm convincing all of my contemporaries that this fossil I found is real. Also, it did not escape my notice that he did go into a little bit of a biased thing, just assuming that he's obviously found exactly the same type of person that he is. I feel like we all fall into that, though, whether we want to or not. So I'm not going to judge too hard the people of the 1800s. So thank you, as always, for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that little bit of Journey to the Center of the Earth. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out. It does always make me smile. And I'll see you tomorrow when maybe we'll find some people.